Greetings. For this podcast, we're going to talk about developmental characteristics of student writing. Or, in other words, how can we talk about children's writing, particularly their development? So, our agenda for this podcast is to attend to Selsby's categories of writing development. And the 6 categories that we're going to talk about are listed on the slide. We will explore each of these and look at student examples and talk about how these categories help us notice and name what is happening in students' writing development. So by the end of this podcast, you should understand this continuum of writing development through these categories, and you should also be able to identify characteristics of student writing within each of them. So, to give you a bit of background on Selsby's categories of writing development, they really organize characteristics of children's writing within these 6 categories you saw on the agenda. Now, it's important to note that these are not developmental markers. In other words, if it's not a checklist, right? It's a cluster of characteristics that tend to gravitate during particular developmental moments, right? So if something is missing, right, when we start talking about some of these categories, that doesn't necessarily mean a child is behind or ahead, etc., etc. They're not developmental markers. Now, these categories are particularly helpful in the ways that they help us notice and name the characteristics of young writers' work. So even though they are developmental, they do give us a vocabulary and kind of a framework for thinking about how to push kiddos forward in their own development. So let's look at the first category, which is writing via drawing. And this is where the entirety of meaning is contained in an image, right? So here's an example of a story that was written about a child and his sister being at home, right? So all of this story is contained in the image itself. We really need, as readers, the author present in order to gain the majority of that story. But this really is meant to be a piece of writing and not just a drawing per se, which challenges us as educators to think about whether student work is drawing or writing. And as educators, we have to be really, really aware of how we frame at this developmental kind of space student work. So here I have 3 different examples of student writing and or drawing. And one of them is a piece of writing, 2 of them are drawings. And looking at the first example, that would probably be the one that we would consider to be writing right off the bat. We see the graphemes A, C, I, a capital I, and an M. However, that is a drawing as defined by the student. It's the middle image that is writing as defined by students. It's a keep out sign that they've created for their room. So it's meant to convey a message of stay out of my room, whereas the last part, the last picture, is also a drawing. Now, as we're thinking through whether a student's piece of work is a drawing or writing, we have to really consider the context. It's really all about the context. We have to think about whether it is a picture or it's intended to communicate or say something, right? And so we have to really think through how the child is conceiving of that piece of work. We have to listen and attend to the context within which the marks are made, right? So when a student brings up a piece of work, whether we think it's a drawing or whether it's a piece of writing, it's always really, really important to respond with something like, oh, tell me about what you did here, versus tell me about your picture. Because automatically then that frames it as a picture. Or tell me about your writing, and then it automatically frames it as writing. We need to be open in terms of letting young children tell us really what they've created, right? And it's by listening and attending to the context that we can figure out how the student is conceiving of that work. Now, in our next category, writing via scribbling, these marks are beginning to become differentiated. As opposed to the earlier category where the picture was really the writing, here we're beginning to see marks that are writing-like and marks that have order. So if you look at the example here, you can see the picture of the two people, and then above it we have these squiggle lines, right, that are very orderly, and they almost have the look of cursive handwriting. And so here we're beginning to see a differentiation between picture and writing itself, right? And it's this scribbling that is assigned a message, right? This says something. And it also shows us that there's a developmental understanding that writing and drawing are different things, right? They're not necessarily pointing to the picture as they're telling their story anymore, as opposed to the earlier category. They're pointing to the words, what they conceive as words, right? And this shows us that they have an awareness that print carries a message. And it should also help us see a beginning understanding of directionality, left to right, top to bottom, although that doesn't always necessarily happen. After writing via scribbling, we often see children start experimenting with letter-like forms, and here you're seeing an example of some of those letter-like forms. The most salient elements of the English language, printed English language, are straight lines and circles, so we're beginning to see some of those shapes really pop out in children's writing. So the interesting thing here is that not all of those symbols are going to accurately represent the alphabet, right? And so Schickedanz and Kasberg remind us that children don't necessarily know that there's only 26 letters right now. So they're creating all kinds of letters. They're hypothesizing about what these letters could be. And so they're creating, using lines, using circles, a variety of ways to represent what they're trying to write down. So this is where we really do start seeing these letter-like things. They're beginning to take what they know about letters and apply them to possibly new forms of letters. As they begin to really consider and think about the ways that more conventional letters are used, we begin to see letter strings. And we move from this mock letter to real letters, and we see them in random order. So oftentimes, like in this example, we see this letter string that oftentimes stands for a sentence or maybe a word itself, but there's often not necessarily a correlation between the letters that are in the letter string and the words that are being read. As children develop and progress, this will change. For instance, a student might write IWTTS, right? I went to the store. They're using letter strings to represent a larger sentence, and they're pulling in their sound knowledge. So we also see a beginning use of letter sequences. So this is where we're going to see kiddos possibly start putting some letters together and thinking through the sequences of like sentences is within this letter string. They also may write one letter a variety of ways, and this gets at the experimental and experiential development of the kiddo as they're realizing the variety of fonts that are available to them, the directionalities, and this isn't necessarily something to be worried about. Kiddos are going to be doing this kind of experimentation, and we want to encourage that kind of experimentation. So writers in this stage are really being thoughtful about reading their own writing, and they're attempting familiar forms of writing, and this could be lists, this could be comics, this could be any kind of form of writing that seems to be helpful and will get them the social kind of good that they need. They're also going to be using simple oral language structure, so if it's a sentence, it's going to be a very kind of simplified or if it's a story, pardon, it's going to be kind of a really simplified story, first, then last. And what's interesting and what begins to happen here in this developmental category is the message begins to be solidified across multiple readings. In other categories, readings tend to change based on when students read it, right? So I've worked with preschoolers who reading the same piece of work, the story changed every day of the week, right? So in this category, we begin to see the message solidifying, the message staying the same across multiple readings. We also begin to see left to right, top to bottom orientations really pop out, and then a lot of experimentation with the one-to-one correspondence between written and spoken language. So we move then into the beginnings of invented spelling, and this is really when we start seeing kids capitalizing on that sound letter relationship. There's a continued imprecision of the marks children use, so you're not going to see beautiful, perfect handwriting at this point, but it's still there. Awareness of spacing is happening, but it's not always conventional. Capital letters and their uses are there, but not always used in the ways that we would like them to be used, and that's okay. And then the presence of final consonant and vowel sounds begins to pop up in this particular category. So this is where we start really seeing kids put together words as we know them, versus in the previous category, kids might put together a letter string that represents the initial sounds in all of the words that they're writing. And then more words are going to be spelled conventionally, but there's still going to be some invented or omitted spelling throughout this particular stage. So in this category, writers are relying on the most obvious sounds within words. They're not necessarily concerned about conventional spellings, and neither should we. We should be really helping them think through what the most obvious sounds within these words are. We also want them to be using a small range of familiar text forms, so and expanding that range of familiar text forms. So if they're really, really comfortable with lists, and they're really, really comfortable with cards, and they're really, really comfortable with letters, helping them continue to think through the variety of forms that kiddos are using. They'll begin to use basic structures and begin to vary sentence beginnings. So it might be, instead of the dog went to the market, my dog went to the market. Those kind of things are going to start changing during this time as well. And then they're going to also identify purposes for writing in particular forms. Before, there was an awareness of it, but now it's going to be much more explicit. Oh, I want to communicate with someone, I should write a letter. They're going to experiment with words from a variety of sources. So they're going to start looking around and seeing what sources they have available to them. They're going to experiment with punctuation, as well as begin to think about the social work of writing, like working with others to plan for a next project. And then last but not least, we end up with writing via conventional spelling. And this is where all the words are spelled correctly, there's proper spacing, the conventions are really, really strong, etc., etc. And this is kind of the end of that space. However, it's important to note that kiddos up through, I don't know, still today, I mean, I often spell words in my own writing if I'm not at a computer, based upon how they sound. So that last stage is really one that we kind of remain in for quite a while. But at the end of the day, this is where we want kids to be mostly, is writing via conventional spelling. So that concludes this particular podcast. So in review, Soulsby delineated 6 stages that help us think about the writing development of young children, all the way from writing via drawing to writing via conventional spelling. Just to reiterate, these aren't developmental stages, but really helpful ways to notice and name what children are doing as they're developing as writers. Each stage has particular characteristics that can be observed in children's writing. So be sure to go back and really understand what some of those differences are as students move from stage to stage.